Good afternoon. Oh, this isn't. Is this working?
They don't hear it. It's on, power's on. It's working. I think you just have to.
Okay.
Test.
Test. Okay. All set? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And welcome to the Lynch School Endowed Chairs Colloquium. He said it's here, but it's light, but I don't know. No. How about are they working over there, Andy? Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the Endowed Chairs Colloquium on Teacher Equality. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and a special thanks to the Endowed Chairs for organizing this. It's been a very exciting presentation series this year, and it has attracted a lot of attention, many critical issues, and today on teacher evaluation is certainly will add to that series. So thank you very much for being here. I want to, Andy Hargreaves, our Grawemeyer Award winner, will give the introductions today. And also a special acknowledgement to Marilyn Cochran-Smith, another endowed chair who just received the Distinguished Scholar Lifetime Achievement Award from the Literacy Research Association. So we have much to celebrate at the end of the semester. And thank all of you for being here. Andy?
Well, packed house this lunchtime, which is extraordinary for this time of year, and a tribute to the speakers, both of them, and all they are going to say today. Many years ago when I lived in England, we had a 3-day retreat from some of the leading researchers in England on quantitative research methods that was being videoed for training purposes. It took place amid the greatest heat wave that England had ever had at the time, and there was no air conditioning. By the end of the 3-day meeting, people were wearing a fraction of the clothes that they arrived in, and it is hot today. The heating is not possible to control. We've opened the windows. If you do remove any clothing, could we just remind you this is being videoed, and so just bear that in mind. We have two fantastic presenters today. First is Thomas Kane, who is the Walter H. Gale Professor of Education and Economics at Harvard with a PhD from Harvard. And Tom self-identifies as an economist, and I think pretty much everybody else would probably identify Tom as an economist as well. He has many achievements around his interests and work in school accountability, teacher recruitment and retention, and teacher effectiveness. Between 2009 and 2012, one of the things Tom's best known for is he directed the Measures of Effective Teaching project for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and which shows that, according to Tom's website and the work that we know, that classroom observations are valid predictors of teacher effectiveness, but implementing classroom observations with rigor and at scale is challenging for even the most resourceful schools and district leaders. Tom has lived in Newton for a very long time. This is his 4th visit to Boston College, and we hope that there will be that there will be many more, and we're looking forward to your presentation today. Followed by that, we have, known to all of us, Diana Pullin. Diana Pullin has her PhD from the University of Iowa and is a professor here in the Educational Leadership and Higher Education Department, and an affiliate professor at the Boston College School of Law. Diana's many interests that intersect between law and education and policy, in testing, in opportunity to learn, in educator quality, in accountability. She has many honors. The one that most of you will know is Diana is known for her fierce reputation as a teacher and exactor of high standards. And yet, which is the kind of teaching that everybody loves, there are lineups to get into her class every year. And not surprisingly, she was the winner of the Distinguished Teacher Award from Boston College in 2004. Amongst her other awards, many of them, she's a National Associate of the National Academy of Sciences. She's a Fellow of the American Education Research Association. She's a Resident Fellow of the Spencer Foundation. She works federally, she works with state departments, and her most recent work is a monograph, a significant monograph on legal issues in performance assessment in teacher education and teacher licensure conducted for the Society of Chief State School Officers, which tries to look at both sides and figure out what the way forward might be. This is a topic of huge importance for the future of teaching and for the future of teacher education. And we will begin with Tom, who will have about 25 minutes. Then we'll move on to Diana, then we'll have some open discussion. Thank you for coming, and thank you for the speakers as well.
So thanks, Andy. I wanted to start by just reminding us why we're going to now spend the next hour and a half talking about teacher evaluation. Because I think in the public debate now, it would be easy to think that the primary reason why we're talking about this is because some of us want to beat up on teachers, or that this is purely a corporate, takeover of education. But we need to pause and realize that teacher evaluation and the tenure review process is the most important system in our school organizations today for ensuring high quality teaching in every classroom. And why do I say that? Well, it's because for 4 decades we've known that there are huge differences in student achievement gains in different teachers' classrooms. That while there is variance at the school level, most of the variance is within school. So which teacher you get within a school has a huge impact on your student achievement at the end of the year. The second thing that we've known for at least 4 decades is that those differences have very little to do with somebody's paper qualifications. So whether or not they have a teaching certificate, but also whether or not, what kind of undergraduate institution they attended, or what their SAT scores were. Those 2 facts, teachers matter, but second, it's hard to know who the good teachers are going to be based on observable characteristics during recruitment, imply that it's extremely important then that once we do have better information about a teacher's effectiveness, that we make hard decisions at the end of this probationary period. So that's why this is such a hot topic, and why so many states and districts around the country are focusing on this. It's a difficult discussion, but as I say, it's one of the most important debates that we could be having, because we know teachers matter, and it's hard to know who the great teachers are going to be during recruitment. So I start with that because now I want to address several of the issues that come up within that debate. Like first, I wanted to start with one of the measurement challenges, where it's funny. I think we get ourselves tied up in knots when we're thinking about the tenure decision and thinking about what kinds of data to use and what kind of decision rules to use. So, for instance, the first thing to remember is that in any tenure decision, there are actually two teachers involved. There's the teacher who's you've got in front of you, say, here's one hypothetical example, Mr. Jones, and there's the anonymous novice teacher who would like to have that job. So there's no way to not make a decision because under most collective bargaining agreements, at the end of the probationary period, if you renew somebody's contract, then that kicks in all sorts of additional due process protections, something we often call tenure. So principals, when they're looking at a probationary teacher, are choosing between two, the teacher that they're looking at and the anonymous novice who would otherwise be teaching that class, the following year if they decided not to promote the teacher. Well, in this graph, imagine there's like a, we had some measure of effectiveness. It doesn't matter what it's based on. It could be based on observations. It could be based on value added. But the important thing is that whatever the measure is, it must be related to students' achievement gain. I've just drawn in the 45-degree line, and below the 45-degree line, students would be better off if Mr. Jones were promoted. Above the 45-degree line, students would be better off if Mr. Jones were not promoted and the teacher were replaced with an anonymous novice. So almost everybody who has looked at, tried to estimate differences in student achievement gains in different teachers' classrooms finds that the average novice, their achievement gains are about 0.08 student level standard deviations below that of the average teacher. And that's what's striking about that is that we see that here in Boston, we see that in every single district that we've looked at. Not only the fact that the novice is underperforming the average teacher, but that the magnitude of the difference is about the same almost everywhere. So imagine here that in the way I've drawn it, suppose that there were the average novice. Now, here this is a hypothetical. Suppose these contour lines capture, suppose in the inner circle, 50% of the possible outcomes that you're going to observe are within that first circle. Suppose, 70% are captured by the outer circle. The point is that those contour lines capture the most likely outcomes here. So the way I've initially drawn it, chances are, because the Mr. Jones effectiveness is above average, most of the area of those two circles is below the line. So the principal students would be better off if the principal erred towards promoting Mr. Jones in that circumstance. And just the opposite. If Mr. Jones's effectiveness were less than average, students would be better off if you decided not to promote Mr. Jones. So that implies, that way of thinking implies a pretty clear standard here that you replace Mr. Jones when his or her predicted effectiveness is below that of the average novice, the anonymous novice, you see. And so if if Mr. Jones is just even a tiny amount more effective than the average novice, then the way to minimize the errors in categorization, the way to maximize the student outcomes would be to promote Mr. Jones if he's slightly above the negative 0.8, and if he's slightly below the negative 0.8, not promote Mr. Jones. And this is all, notice, I've not said a thing about confidence intervals, because you've got two teachers involved here, and the way to minimize the error is to make the call one way or another, as long as this measure that you're using is valid in predicting student outcomes. Now, what would the threshold look like if you were just using confidence intervals? So suppose you were using the classical hypothesis testing framework. Well, you'd say, okay, what was the distribution of this? What was the sampling distribution for this teacher's effectiveness? Yes, you've got a mean, but there's going to be a range of possibilities. So suppose you determine, okay, where the 2.5 percentile and then the 97.5 percentile. And you use those thresholds and say, okay, if Mr. Jones's effectiveness is below this line, then we'd only then would we fail to promote Mr. Jones. But if Mr. Jones were above this line, we'd keep him, because under this framework, somebody is presumed average until proven not average. But notice, in this circumstance, that's the wrong threshold to use. You're actually increasing the chance of making an error when you use the classical hypothesis testing framework, where you have two choices. So, for instance here, clearly the probability of making a mistake, the probability that this anonymous novice is better than Mr. Jones, is far more than 50-50. So most of the area is above the 45-degree line, but because Mr. Jones's effectiveness is greater than that lower threshold, you'd keep the teacher. So this is just showing that when there are two teachers involved, because the errors are symmetric, classical hypothesis testing is the wrong threshold to use, and in fact will lead you to make mistakes. All right. The second part of my talk I wanted to focus on, okay, there's a big discussion, has been for the last few years, on whether or not student achievement gains, or so-called value-added measures, should be used as part of a teacher's evaluation. And I think based on what we've learned in the last few years, we can have a reasonable discussion of whether, what the weight ought to be, whether or not the weight should be 0.25 or 0.3 or 0.4, 0.5. But I think it's no longer reasonable to argue that the weight should be 0. And here's why. Because you might just say, let's set up the hypothetical and say, what would you have to believe in order to argue that student achievement gains should play absolutely no role in a teacher's evaluation? Well, one argument I've heard people make is, well, value-added measures are equivalent to a coin flip. No, that is saying not just that value-added, there's some noise in the measures. That's saying that in order to be able to argue that they shouldn't be used at all, you'd be saying, hey, look, it's not just that there's noise, but that there's so much noise they're not providing any information whatsoever. So think back to the Mr. Jones versus the anonymous novice. if I have any information about Mr. Jones's effectiveness, I ought to use it, even if there's a huge amount of variation around it, even if those circles are big circles. Well, so, but if the value-added measures have no information in it, so there's no way to predict, then actually maybe you wouldn't use those measures. So it's not whether or not there's some noise, but whether or not there's any predictive power that should be the determinant. I'll show you in a second that we know that's not the case. A second argument that people will make is, okay, value-added measures are driven largely by unmeasured differences in the students assigned to different teachers' classrooms. So the only way to resolve this concern, and it's a legitimate concern because, as we know over time, that typically when people do program evaluations using non-experimental methods, so use prior achievement, race, ethnicity, English language learner status, free reduced price lunch status as control variables, you would end up with a very different answer than if you used random assignment. So in most fields, you wouldn't want to rely on the non-experimental estimate as providing a causal estimate because you'd be worried that there are lots of other unmeasured differences between classrooms that are systematically associated with a given teacher. Well, one way to test that, well, the only way to test that really, it would be to collect data on classrooms when they're assigned in the usual way, so pre-random assignment. Generate the value-added estimates, generate classroom observations, which, by the way, would be subject to all the same worries as value-added, by the way. Classroom observation could be driven by unmeasured differences in the students in the classroom that you're observing during the classroom observation. But the only way to resolve that would be to collect those data 1 year, then in the second year, randomly assign classrooms and see whether the measure collected in the first year provided an accurate prediction of what happened following random assignment. Now, in that second year, you're not saying that there aren't other characteristics that are driving students' achievement. You're just saying that whatever those characteristics are, they're unrelated to the measures you collected in the first year because by construction, you randomly assign them. So that's actually what we did in the Measures of Effective Teaching project. We collected for teachers classroom observations. We measured student achievement gains. We actually added in some student surveys during the 2009-10 school year. And then during the summer of 2010, we randomly assigned classes so that during the 2010-11 school year, teachers in effect drew straws within a grade and school to see which classroom they would teach. And then we assigned teachers to classrooms. And then we just asked, okay, were the differences in achievement following random assignment consistent with what we would have predicted based on the first year? Here's what we found. So this dotted line is not the fitted line, it's the actual equals predicted line. It's the line where the actual differences were exactly equal to the predicted differences. It would turn out it would be very close to the fitted line if you were to fit a line for those points. But each of those dots is for a group of 40 teachers arranged in terms of their predicted achievement using past measures of teaching. And on the vertical axis is their actual achievement following random assignment. And as you can see, we were able to predict student achievement. So the argument that value added is driven just by unmeasured differences in classrooms is at least, there's evidence that that's not the case. And there have been several other studies that have done the same thing. 2 using random assignment and 1 using teacher movement between schools that finds the same fact that you can predict changes in test scores using these value-added measures. So the argument that it's purely driven by unmeasured differences is not true. The argument that it's purely a coin flip does not seem to be true either. Okay. So what would be another argument? So one would have to argue that in order to exclude value-added completely, that value-added measures are not reflective of a teacher's practice. Well, we again, that's not true. In the Measures of Effective Teaching project, we asked whether the teachers who had scored better on the classroom observation rubrics also had higher value-added, and the answer was yes. You'd ask, okay, well, teachers with high value-added scores are just teaching test-taking skills. Well, it could be that they are teaching some test-taking skills, but if they were just teaching test-taking skills, then you wouldn't see any differences on other tests that weren't being used for any kind of accountability purposes. Well, as part of the project, we administered some additional assessments outside, in addition to the state assessments, where in math, we used the balanced assessment of mathematics. In literacy, we used the open-ended version of the Stanford 9 reading test. And both of those tests were very different in format from the types of tests being used in the states where the MET project was being done. And we actually found that the teachers who were predicted to have bigger gains on the state tests also had bigger gains on this other test following random assignment. The differences were about 2/3 as large in terms of standard deviation units as the differences predicted with the state test. So that argument doesn't seem to hold. Another argument is Campbell's law says the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to measure. But what people who cite Campbell's law often fail to do is read Campbell, because several paragraphs later, he says, many commentators, including myself, assume that the use of multiple indicators, all recognized as imperfect, will alleviate the problem. Although he says Ridgway doubts this. He is saying we ought to be averaging together multiple measures. Well, I don't know of anybody these days who is arguing that value added should be used alone. Certainly not me. And so the argument should be, okay, if any of these measures is subject to distortion, and clearly there is that risk, that applies to the value-added measure, but that also applies to the classroom observation. It also applies to the student survey. And the way to deal with that is to use multiple measures, each with different possibilities of distortion, to reduce that chance that any particular one is a teacher's route to a higher score. So you can't eliminate the problem, but you can reduce it by including multiple measures. Now, one of the big questions that we're all going to be facing, we face as a field, is can we identify effective ways to improve instruction? And you'll find some people who will wonder, well, is teaching an art? Can teaching be improved? Do we have any idea how to improve teaching? Well, I'd argue that we do have evidence that teaching can be improved. And it's the same evidence I cited before in terms of the improvements in effectiveness from the first to the second to the third year of teaching. Here are the data from Boston, and you see that the difference in effectiveness, and this is purely a value-added based measure, from first to second year is about 0.08, and it flattens out after 2 or 3 years. Some people in other states, for instance, North Carolina, find that that trend keeps going up, but in Boston, it flattens out after year 3. But we found that in a number of different places. So here I've just plotted the same figure for LAUSD, Gwinnett County in Georgia, Fulton County in Georgia, Denver Public Schools. Similar pattern, rapid gains first through third year, and the gains are about the same magnitude everywhere. So we know practice can be improved. But what's the evidence that we know how to improve practice on a large scale? It's not very encouraging. So for instance, if this was data from LA from 2001, the reason why I go back that far was prior to No Child Left Behind Act, LA was hiring a lot of what they called emergency credentialed teachers. So these were teachers who had no prior training and were not part of an alternative certification program. And so this is plotting for 3 different groups of teachers: the uncertified, who were these emergency credentialed teachers, the traditionally certified, and the alternatively certified. And there should be 2 things that are clear. One is that there are huge differences in effectiveness within each of these groups. I alluded to that earlier. But there are very little or no differences between the groups. So yes, we know teaching can be taught and improved, but our current model of teacher preparation, there's very little evidence that it's actually achieving that. Now, there are new models that have been discussed, residency models. So for instance, here in Boston, there's the Boston Teacher Residency. But the early evidence on the BTR model is mixed at best. So in the first year, if you plot the red dot there is the average student achievement gains for Boston teacher residents, adjusting for their students' prior achievement and characteristics. The blue dot is for the non-BTR novices, and you can see actually the point estimate is that the BTR teachers underperform the non-BTR. Same in the second and third year. By the 4th or 5th year, there is some evidence that at least the point estimate for the BTR residents is above that, at least more effective than the average teacher, which is the horizontal line there. But that's based on just one cohort, and as a result, the estimates are really imprecise. So I'm not sure that we've figured out, so we know that clinical experience matters based on what we've seen in these alternative models, based on what we've seen in terms of returns to experience, but I'm not sure we've figured out how to deliver that with the residency model. So let me just close by, let me jump through this. Emphasizing this last point, that when you think about, in the past, when we've tried to do professional development, it's been the equivalent of trying to do adult behavior change without any feedback. It would be equivalent to starting a Weight Watchers program without any bathroom scales or mirrors. And so one hypothesis for why investment in professional development and why it's been hard either through on-the-job training or in pre-service training to to actually drive changes in practice is because of the absence of a feedback system or evaluation system. And ideally, so that, again, that's one hypothesis. We don't have evidence that that's the reason why PD hasn't worked in the past, but that's one idea that I think we ought to be working on, is in a system where you were providing feedback, would principals not only be better prepared to make tenure decisions, which I started out arguing is one of the most important decisions they make, but could we also create an environment where adults could be more likely to be able to manage changes in their own practice and improve the quality of the PD and the traditional training that we provide.
Well, no, I'm not going to do that. Stay here with it and let's see if this works. Let's just see how this works. I'm worried that my slides aren't on that screen. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer. I think Professor Kane is doing very important work, and I applaud him for his efforts. He's an economist. He gets to conceptualize methodologies, study data. I'm a lawyer. I deal with unintended consequences and undue harm. So it's my job to think about what happens in the world when research goes out and is used as a policy tool. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Kendra, where's your clicker? Because my thing is not working the way it's supposed to. Sorry, and thank you. Is that synced to a... So, what I'm focusing on lately is a lot of work where I try to understand how initiatives to improve practice actually change what happens in the world. And what I've been wondering about in particular is how to situate the kind of work Professor Kane has done in terms of thinking about how it plays out in the context of the teaching professions, what implications it and other phenomena have on teacher education, and what's shaping the public narrative, the narrative of ordinary people in ordinary places about what goes on in schools, what teachers do, how they think about teachers, and how they think about teacher education. So I am concerned about what these corporate education reform initiatives, as they've been called by some people, what happens when the federal government and the states embrace these kinds of initiatives, and what both the intended and the unintended consequences are. Clearly, some of this is about improving education practice. Clearly, some of this is about blunting the power of the teacher unions. Clearly, some of this is going to play out over time, and it's hard to predict how it will look. But the first word of caution I would offer in sort of setting the context here is that I think increasingly the context of whatever goes on in education, either K-12 or higher education, has to be situated in an understanding of the sometimes conflicting goals that people have about our educational system. And there are education scholars who've been writing about this for a long period of time. On the one hand, we have this long-held romantic notion that the importance of education is to serve a civic purpose, to make a better world, to improve broadly writ the individual and their role in that world. But there's also a notion that is much more credentialist, that the role of education is for individual benefit, to give more credential to an individual, to enhance the economic and social opportunities of the individual and his family. And there's increasing evidence that that individual benefit perspective on the role of educational institutions is increasing in our society. So when I look at these kinds of conflicts, that's what I think about. So I'm going to talk about a few legal controversies. Professor Kane was a witness in this one I'm going to talk about first. So the case is Vergara, and it was an effort to try to dismantle the tenure system or impact the tenure system in line with the sorts of issues that Professor Kane was talking about in his presentation. And the idea in California was to look at some state statutes that regulated teacher tenure, that determined teacher dismissal for employed teachers, and then these last in, first out systems that are used when teachers have to be laid off. And the argument was that under the Constitution of California, every public school child has a right to education under the state constitution, and that the implementation of these dysfunctional systems for treating teachers denied students their right to education under the California Constitution. Before I give you the answer the court gave to that question, let me note clearly, there is no right to education under the federal Constitution. Lots of people think there is, but there is no such right to education under the federal Constitution, and there is no right to education for our children in Massachusetts. So the argument in California is slightly different from what it would be here. So as the question, did those California state statutes protecting teachers and allowing, for example, teachers to gain tenure after less than 2 years on the job, did those provisions violate students' state constitutional right to education? The court says yes. Under the California Constitution, students have a right to education, and these teacher protection systems violated that right to education. The case is now on appeal. We'll have to stay tuned to see what happens next in the appellate courts. But it's not just the legal system in which these disputes play themselves out. This is the headline about the case from Time magazine, reporting on the story later. It caused a lot of consternation on the part of many teacher unions and teachers. Bad apples is the headline that people remember when they take away the message from the story in that case. And while the testimony in California was that 1% to 3% of teachers were estimated to be ineffective, the concern I have is, does that headline and other social discourse suggest that the generalization should be much broader? Does this have the effect when it gets into the media in this way? Does this have the effect of further demeaning the teaching profession and teachers? All well-intended efforts to improve educational opportunity for kids, but when it plays out in the media and in our public discourse, are there some other harms that start to ensue? Let's look at some other initiatives that became law-related, and will be more law-related in the future. Professor Kane described some of his work on student growth models. I'll talk briefly about those. I'll also talk briefly about the increasing focus on using portfolio and performance assessments to make judgments about teachers, particularly for licensure. An example of this would be the EdTPA system that is in play, that was field tested here a couple of years ago. So when we start using these new measures based on new science, when we start to undertake these efforts to change performance based on these policy ideas and research or lack of research. And when we also do this in a context in which there's a lot of concern about other social policy and socioeconomic issues in our society, I suggest that there are further bases for our concern. So let's look first at what I believe firmly is an unintended consequence of the embedding of value-added models into teacher evaluation. This is Mrs. Cook. Mrs. Cook, this is from her Facebook page, I believe. She's a teacher in a K-12 public school in Alachua County in Florida. They have countywide school districts down there. In the teacher evaluation system that was created in Florida in response to federal initiatives, student achievement data on the FCAT, the Florida Comprehensive Assessment Test, is used to create a value-added measure. That value-added measure becomes part of the teacher portfolio performance assessment and evaluation. Mrs. Cook and Irby Elementary School are working in a setting in which Irby Elementary School only serves K-3 kids. Mrs. Cook is, in fact, a third-grade teacher. Because her school only serves third-grade kids, none of the kids participated in the FCAT, the state testing system. When it came time to calculate Mrs. Cook's evaluation measures, they had no student test scores to use for her, so they got them from the building down the street. She'd never taught any of those children, and that became 40% of her teacher evaluation score. This is not what Professor Kane intends to have done, but this is what happened. And she's standing in front of the sign in front of her building, recognizing that she had just been recognized by her school as their Teacher of the Year. What she's holding up is the outcome of her teacher performance evaluation as a result of the inclusion of those student test scores. And she went from a highly satisfactory teacher to being unsatisfactory. This is all according to Florida statute created and implemented as a result of the federal initiatives. It's not surprising to learn, especially if you started reading her social media presence, that she was quite exercised by this. So she became the named plaintiff in a case called Cook versus Bennett, which was sponsored by the National Education Association. This case never got to trial. There were some affidavits from expert witnesses, but there was never actually any trial court testimony. The case was resolved very quickly, and here's what the judge said. This is a federal district court judge, I believe in Tallahassee, who is an Obama appointee. Needless to say, this court would be hard-pressed to find anyone who would find this evaluation system fair, let alone be willing to submit to a similar evaluation system. However, he upheld the use of the evaluation system on grounds that it was reasonable to believe that the state could feel that this system might incentivize better teaching. Now, note the image that has embedded in it about teachers. Note the image embedded there about teachers. This case is also on appeal. There are other initiatives to use student outcomes to determine not only the effectiveness of K-12 educators, but also to determine the effectiveness of the people who work in this building, schools of education. So I want to talk also about the next waves of performance assessment. Variations on these proposals about the use of student test scores to make determinations about educators. So I don't know if you followed it, but there was recently a proposal from Massachusetts Commissioner of Education to withdraw teaching licenses for teachers who did poorly on evaluations. That was proposed but not implemented. The teacher union mounted a huge wave of hostility to the proposal, and it was withdrawn very quickly. But the other ways in which performance assessment results will play out in making decisions about educators and teacher educators are the new standards from CAPE, the Council on the Accreditation for Educator Preparation. Embedded in those standards are gathering evidence about ed schools graduates and how our graduates' students do on state student tests. So it's not just an attribution to the teacher, it's an attribution back to the teacher ed institution. And I should note that part of the problem with these systems is, of course, our place sends teachers all over the country, so that's going to be an issue. The other problem is that these systems don't always take into account the fact that it's really only about, estimated, only about 30% of the teachers in the country actually teach subjects and students who are tested on these tests. So then you have another set of quandaries. Do you add more tests, or you determine another measure for trying to make attributions about contributions to student success? But CAPE is coming down the road, and I can expect that it would impact the Lynch School. And then just Wednesday of last week, the federal government proposed new regulations under Title II of the Higher Education Act. Quite honestly, the previous version of Title II had been pretty well corrupted in implementation, in part with the cooperation of colleges and universities trying to protect themselves, honestly. But these new regulations, and I'm just beginning to digest them, but these new regulations are going to label educator preparation programs based on quality indicators. There'll have to be a new form of an institutional report card. There'll have to be a new form of a state report card. And embedded in these systems will be program quality indicators based on student learning outcomes. So, or teacher evaluation measures, or both. It will be it will be based on the proposal at the state's choice. They'll also base reports on survey data from completers, on and I forgot to fill in the and. Survey data from completers and people who supervise the students who are placed out in the field. There will be also conditions placed on an institution's capacity to award teach grants to students based on these systems. So this is an extremely powerful set of regulations. It's still in the proposed stage. It's been being proposed for years, and there was never a capacity to get the whole community of stakeholders to agree what the requirements should be. But you have until February to submit comments about this system, and you'd be well advised to pay attention and do that if you have an opportunity. So these are sort of current initiatives, and what to me were, as I was asked by the Council of Chief State School Officers and the folks at Stanford to look at these kinds of systems, these are kind of the regular sorts of questions that came to my mind as a lawyer and a public policy researcher when I started paying attention. But then it became evident to me that in addition to the unintended consequences that could cause people to have less respect for teachers and even less respect for teacher education, there are a number of other sets of social, cultural issues with potential legal consequences that are also at play here. And I would say many of these are things I never thought I would have to think about in my career, but I've learned a lot in the past year or so about a whole set of new legal issues. So the first set of issues has to do with new teacher licensure requirements based on portfolio performance assessment. Like EdTPA, there are various versions of these systems, but they all rely upon having a future educator submit a video clip or more describing or depicting candidate performance in teaching. And these videos are edited, there are narratives submitted, et cetera, but part of the heart of the submitted portfolio is a videotape of classroom performance, including the capture of performance of real, actual, true K-12 kids. And what people don't realize is that there are federal laws and state laws that govern information about kids, but they're woefully out of date when it comes to addressing the kinds of systems we're talking about here. There are also state laws on recording people that are basically wiretapping statutes that you think about as being used in the old days when they actually twisted wire into people's phone lines. Remember phone lines? Some of you probably never had any. These require consent. And many teacher candidates seeking licensure under the gun to get their portfolios submitted have been sloppy about getting consent. So some concerns have been raised about whether they're violating these state wiretapping statutes. There is not just FERPA on the federal law side of the equation that applies with its requirements about protection of confidential student data, which would also require consent. But there are at least 6 other federal statutes that might apply as you use the internet to submit your portfolio, for example, as you collect data from kids as they're doing online activities, which is increasingly prevalent. There are a raft of privacy issues that come up around these systems that have not been adequately addressed and where the law is quite insufficient. And as I think about this sort of set of potential legal issues in the context of how people are reacting to teachers and what's going on in schools, I should not have been surprised at what started to be being reported in the media and being presented to me by people in various states and in various teacher education programs. In an era in which many adults engage in sometimes absurd oversharing in social media, pick your image. Parents are extremely vigilant about protecting the privacy of their own children. Extremely vigilant about protecting the privacy of their own children. And they are so concerned about what will happen when a future educator uses a videotape to submit to a state or actually to a vendor through an online platform, that they have shut down the use of videotapes in Missouri temporarily because they're so concerned. School districts are refusing to allow student teachers to do the videotaping they need to do in order to compile their performance portfolio. And I now understand from a conversation with a teacher educator in Texas recently that some school districts are now refusing to take future teachers in practicum placements because they don't want to have the videotaping going on in their schools. Now that to me represents both a level of concern about privacy and unintended consequences. It also represents a lack of respect for the professionalism of the people in the schools who would be doing this kind of work and submitting these sorts of documents. The parental concern is not surprising. The other place in which it's come up in what I call sort of next generation legal issues is sort of concern about big data. A lot of the data being collected in schools right now is collected by outside vendors, many of them for-profit vendors, many who have very different approaches to how to think about the data they collect and how they use it. Vigilant parents are very concerned about the storage of data about their child on the cloud. And they're particularly concerned when they actually start to read the representations that these cloud vendors make about their inability to actually protect data. If you couple that with the concerns about losing your credit card number at Target or Michael's or whatever, well, we're all sort of used to losing our credit card data at some store now. It's almost an expected part of our commercial life. But nobody wants to think about their kids' data being taken inappropriately and used by some vendor in an education context. So one parent group in New York organized itself and used social media so successfully that they actually brought down a cloud vendor that had been created to assist the states. Their litigation wasn't successful, but the vendor, which had been sponsored by the Gates Foundation and had been supported by the Council of Chief State School Officers, the vendor in Bloom ended up folding up its tent and leaving the business. There's also a set of questions about how much the public really has a right to know about what's going on in schools, and when some of that information needs to be kept private. So there have been a number of conflicts in which journalists have sought individual teacher evaluation information, including their value-added scores, or sought the data that could be used to hire an economist to create their own value-added scores. And question about whether under state law those data about individual teachers are private or public. In most states they're private, but in some states your teacher evaluation data is public data. In a state where your individual teacher evaluation data is public, do the state laws regulating what the press and the public can have access to actually limit the capacity of journalists to publish rank-ordered listings of individual teachers with their scores? And in the litigation that's ensued, some judges under some state statutes have said that's private information, And other judges have said, no, that is public information. The public has a right to know about what's going on in schools, and given the power of these initiatives, individual teacher scores should be published, and they have been. The other set of questions, and I'll just go through these briefly, have to do with other kind of business context claims. So suddenly I go from being a person who made a career out of civil rights and constitutional law issues to somebody who's thinking, gosh, when I was in law school, I should have studied more about business, but who wanted to? Now I'm learning a lot of business law. So there are all these new sorts of claims coming up from the business context. And if you think about what I talked about at the beginning, you know, it's no longer just a civic purpose for education. It's a credentialist, consumer-oriented deal. If you're feeling that education is going awry for you or your kid, and if you're thinking about education as primarily serving some consumerist, credentialist purpose for yourself, if there's a problem, why wouldn't you go to a business lawyer as opposed to a civil rights lawyer? Why wouldn't you go to the police? So there was a scoring error on the Praxis a few years back. I can't say what I do when I use my law license, but let's just say that some people I don't usually talk to wanted to ask me how they could make a consumer claim against ETS for a scoring error on an exam. And I said, that's, you know, that doesn't seem viable to me. Well, they did it, and they won, and ETS was so eager to settle the case that there was a multi-million-dollar settlement the day after the suit was filed. The people who suffered the scoring error treated it like buying a car that was a lemon. And ETS, to its credit, admitted it made a mistake and tried to make the situation whole. But when you have people who think of education as a consumer good and lawyers who are willing to enforce business law requirements, then there are all kinds of possibilities here. So who owns the intellectual property of a teacher performance portfolio? Who owns the lesson plan? There's a whole copyright law on that, and the bottom line is probably a classroom teacher employed by a district owns a lesson plan. A student teacher does not own the lesson plan, the school district does. A student teacher might own their lesson plan. Now, does that make sense? Of course not. So there's a possible set of legal issues with no clear resolution. Defective products, well, that's going to come up with increasing frequency, and people have been suing universities on grounds that they didn't get what they bargained for when they entered into a program. Watch for that. Whistleblower cases. Here's something I never thought about. Under the federal law and many state statutes, you have the power, when you see fraud in the expenditure of government funds, you have the power to bring a whistleblower claim, which, if successful, could not only expose the fraud against the public treasury, but also result in a monetary award to you for blowing the whistle. So whistleblower claims have been mounted against some of these systems. And then, as Professor Kane noted, there are sometimes a lot of unintended consequences for these systems. So there have been increases in charges of cheating, increases in charges of corruption, and there is a major criminal trial going on in Atlanta right now against the former superintendent of schools and a number of both principals and school-level practitioners for cheating in the system. And it's being treated as a criminal law matter. So there's a lot here. There are lofty goals at stake, but there's also a lot that falls into the realm of what's happening and what, over the long term, will be the consequences in people's perceptions about teachers, teacher educators, and the education profession.
So now we move after, we are with two towering figures in this field, so it's a huge privilege. As you may have guessed, may not agree on absolutely everything. So we have an opportunity for Q&A, and if a question or something like it doesn't come up, so Professor Kane, how do you respond to Professor Pullin's critique? Then that question may come up later from the table here, or I'm sure an answer may come in response to whatever question is asked. So it is time now for, after this great set of two positions, what questions do people have? Or comments? Alec?
Well, I would, first of all, thank you both. This was really wonderful presentations. Professor Kane, when you were talking about the multiple measures that can be used, the one thing I didn't see was how you might weight those various measures. And I kind of think that would be something that would be part of the legal problems. So, I don't know, perhaps I could hear from you and then perhaps Diana.
So, I think the only way to think about the weighting question would be to say, okay, well, you know, what is the goal of the measure, you know, and what would be the weights that are most consistent with that goal? So one goal of the measure, particularly when used in a tenure decision, is to identify which teacher is likely to have better student achievement gains in the future. And for making that decision, prior evidence of student achievement gains provides a lot of information. But that's not the only goal. The other goals would be to try to increase reliability in the measure. So if you're worried about the degree to which the measure might bounce around from year to year, you might say, well, are there some components like the student survey, which, while they may not have as much predictive power as the prior student achievement gains, maybe are less likely to bounce around from year to year. And the third goal would be, okay, there are other measures other than student achievement gains. For instance, in MET, we had these other test score measures. So are the student surveys or the classroom observations more likely to identify teachers that have exemplary outcomes on these other tests other than the state tests? And so in one of the reports from the MET project, we said, okay, suppose we just did a model exercise where we at least used our data to ask if we had these three goals, predicting student achievement gains on the state test, predicting other outcomes on other assessments other than the state test, and increasing reliability, what kind of weighting makes sense? And we showed that, you know, whereas that like basically a third weighting on student achievement gains, a third weighting on classroom observations, and a third weighting on student survey results provided the best mix. But if your goal were just to predict student achievement gains on the state test, you'd put a ton of weight on the student achievement gains.
Thank you. Do I have another question? Yeah.
So I agree that we need to ensure teacher quality, but I guess my question is, when I think back on my childhood and my schooling, I remember not the teachers that, you know, I don't remember the scores I achieved, and I don't remember how well I did in certain classes. I remember the teachers that looked at me, that empowered me, that inspired me, drove me, that motivated me. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you measure that?
So actually, in your question, there's a presumption that those teachers are different from the teachers who see achievement gains. And that was actually one of the things we were testing, was to what extent do the teachers who use the practices that are captured by the Danielson rubric, which are not just, you know, were you teaching to the test, but like, were you asking questions that were engaging a lot of students in the class? Were students asking each other questions? And on the student survey, we asked things like, do you agree, disagree? We learn a lot in this class almost every day. Do you agree, disagree? We use time well in this class and we don't waste time. Think questions like that. And it turns out that there are commonalities now across these different measures. And I would just argue it's fundamentally important that a measure include different measures, not just the achievement gains, although I would assert that the achievement gains are an important component, and which in many areas overlaps with these other components. But for a balanced system, I'd argue for the multiple measures. Now, here's one area where I think that there is potentially lots of common ground, and that is developing a system that works better than the system we've got now. I'd argue that just as damaging, and maybe even more damaging, to the reputation of the teaching profession is the NEA and the AFT's stance to defend the bottom 1% to 3% grossly ineffective teachers in LA, rather than say, hey, look, that is an issue. We're going to work with you to develop a better system, and I think if they were to do that, there would be a ton of common ground in coming up with a better system. And actually, I think that single move would do much more to improve the reputation of the profession than the damage done by that headline, the cover from Time magazine, which I agree was unfortunate. But arguably, we ought to be asking, do we do the profession any good to stonewall any effort to focus on effectiveness where we know there are big differences?
And I agree with you completely. And I think, and I've said this to the NEA, that part of the difficulty here is they feel caught in a lot of powerful political forces that they feel put them under siege. So trying to get them to think not just about defending members, but about the long-term scenario about the teaching profession is tricky. And there is a long history of, I once spent many, many weeks reading every possible court case you could read that resulted in a teacher termination based on evaluation. And it's shocking how seldom teachers are actually terminated because of their pedagogy. They're much more likely to be terminated for drinking beer with cheerleaders. And why did that even have to go to court? You should know not to drink beer with the cheerleaders. But is there a way for the profession to, be it teacher unions or teacher ed programs, is there a way to figure out how to embrace change constructively in this context? That's the question.
By the way, on that, Diana, one area where an example of some another example of common ground is in the use of videos and NTPA as alternative measures of effectiveness other than value added. Now, I actually, so let me back up. In the Measures of Effective Teaching project, I didn't go through all the background on that, but we had to recruit 3,000 teachers in 6 different school districts around the country. And we had to do it in a few months. So as you might imagine, that was hard. And in fact, we needed a lot of help to do it. And in that case, the UFT in New York and the NEA affiliate in Memphis and the AFT affiliate in I guess it's a joint NEA AFT affiliate in Hillsborough, were extremely helpful. And you might say, well, why? Well, they recognized that the current classroom observation process was fundamentally broken. And they knew that the state could technically implement a value-added model, just with the data they already had. But the best way to guard against a purely value-added based measure was to help develop the other components, the classroom observation and the student survey. So I think a similar argument could be made here, that I do think that video offers all sorts of efficiencies, would increase the quality and value of feedback to teachers, and could be the basis for driving changes in practice and leading to that development. And it would be a shame if the legitimate concerns about student privacy then completely overturn the practice. Clearly, we need ways of protecting the videos and so forth. But if we get a world where you can't use video for classroom observations, the downside of that will be the test scores will be overweighted. And that the classroom observations could revert to the old system where 98% of people were given the same satisfactory score. So if we're going to have a richer, non-test-based evaluation system, we need the current efforts to succeed.
So if I dare ask one question, one of our priorities here in the Lynch School and at Boston College is the importance of international comparisons, international data, international evidence. Some economists, I don't know whether this is true of you, talk about things called externalities, and externalities are contextual factors that are ruled out and not part of the calculations and comparisons that are made. One of the interesting pieces of your data is looking at various systems within the US, is some kind of apparent plateau or flattening off around about year 4. So one question I think some of us who do international work might have is, in countries that provide better support for their teachers, that have rigorous university preparation for all their teachers, that provide quality continuous professional development, and that, like Finland, for example, or Canada, that provide a significant in-school time for teachers to collaborate and develop their social capital to support each other. Do you see the same plateau at year 4 as you do across systems within the US?
So that is a great question. So we see that in the chart that I showed you, that in a number of districts, I just showed you 5, but if I could have showed you that for 20 and it would have looked very similar. We see this plateauing grade 3 or 4, year 3 or 4. Except, as I mentioned, in North Carolina, there's some evidence, and I'm not sure whether this is a North Carolina specific thing. I don't think anybody knows yet. There is some evidence of continuing when people analyze North Carolina data, but everywhere else it's that same plateauing pattern that I've seen. And we don't know whether that's something that's inherent about teaching and how people learn to teach, or whether that can be continued after the 3rd or 4th year. I would certainly hope that it is something that could be continued. But as far as I know, I've not seen that same kind of analysis generated with data from say, Finland or even Singapore, for instance. But that would be a great question to ask.
There is some evidence, but we'll talk about which seems to be contradictory, but we can talk about that another time. But it is worth looking at, as you say. Question there, and then at the back. Yeah.
So this, I think, will hopefully be a pretty quick question. Dr. Kane, on your initial slides you had as your header, zero value added or zero like additional information, zero usefulness.
Yeah, so I said, what would you have to believe in order to attach zero weight? And then I had a bunch of statements that I then said, look, there's no evidence.
So I was hoping to ask both of you. So I think everybody can agree that the zero weight is going to be very unlikely, right? If it would ever be observed in practice. And so my question is, where would each of you draw the cutoff for how much weight we would need to get from these systems before the benefits outweigh the drawbacks? So as context, I think many of us know that several years ago, a study of the SAT was conducted, and they found that the SAT contributes only 7% additional explanation of first-year GPA above and beyond high school GPA. And as a result, many universities are now dropping the SAT. So I'm just curious, if not at zero, where would you draw the line? 10%, 50%, 90%?
So I feel like I answered that by saying, at least in the measures of effective teaching data, that the combination that did the best job of balancing at least those three outcomes, the predicted power with respect to state tests, predicted power with respect to unmeasured outcomes and reliability, I ended up arguing for a third, so a third on state test value added. But I'd love to hear Diana's answer.
So it's a great question. I think the difficulty is that I can't, given my background, answer that question without knowing what the stakes are associated with the practice. So the more personal the consequence is from a legal perspective, the more fraught that decision is. Now note, I think Tom would say, well, that's not the way to look at it. The way to look at it is in terms of thinking of the broader good. But if you had a system that was really a formative evaluation system, which is where I think we need to start, a formative evaluation system could be constructed with weightings in different ways, as long as it was situated in a context where there was appropriate professional development, where we weren't just starting to implement the Common Core curriculum standards, where we had mentors. I mean, it's like all of this. It's a very complex set of factors that have to be taken into account. I can't sit here and say I'm comfortable drawing a bright line at X place. What I am comfortable saying is what's troubled me increasingly as I think about what's going on in all these areas is that what really is important here is making learning opportunities better for kids. It's not sanctioning teachers, it's not dissing teacher ed programs, it's what do we have evidence about that could really improve kids' learning opportunity. And so many of these systems that are in play now are shaming systems, are penalty systems. You know, what is Mrs. Cook supposed to do for the people down the street whose scores are being used to judge 40% of her evaluation? She can do some kind of professional goodness stuff, but I would like to see a formative system before we start drawing these lines in a way that are being used in some of the states now.
I mean, here's one unfortunate.
Sorry, can I hold, because there's two more lurking questions.
All right, I'm still going to answer this.
I know you are. I know. So could I suggest that we take the two questions, actually one question following the other, and in relation to the questions and anything else you've not yet been able to say that you're bursting to say, that each of you closes with a few sentences. How would that be? Closes with a few sentences. Okay, good. Because yeah, at the back, and then Dr. Pat McQuillan behind me. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to make this quick. So a couple things that the two of you said I thought were really important. Dr. Pullin said that 70% of teachers teach in, and correct me if I'm wrong, teach in subjects that are not tested. And Dr. Kane, you said that something in the beginning about performance assessments can be really useful, but are very difficult to sort of implement at scale. And I think, Dr. Pullin, you kind of I think I got what you might say to this in the last response. Dr. Kane, how would you sort of reconcile that issue of, you know, there's so many teachers who would be sort of left out of this? And I was a social studies teacher, and I know a lot of educators, a lot of people in this room who would feel that unless you're like just testing content in social studies, like it's really difficult to have a standardized, authentic social studies assessment.
Okay, great. So that's one question. Hold that behind us.
Okay, well mine is, it's been
Yeah.
60 years since Brown versus Board of Education was passed. And as best I know, I've spent about 25 of those years in urban schools, and I haven't seen notable improvements in urban schools. And if you look across the country, I don't think there's any district that we can point to that's really doing exemplary work with in urban schools and their student achievement. Can we frame this situation in terms of urban schools? And if we do, what does that help us with, and how does it help us kind of move ahead and serve people who, for the last 60 years and longer, have been so poorly served by the schools?
Thank you for both the questions. Professor Pullin, some closing remarks in response to those and other things, and then our guest, Professor Kane.
I guess my final thought would be that, as Professor McClellan's question just noted, we still need to do so much better in schools than we're currently able to do. And we have vast work to do within the education professions. Part of this, in my view, part of the situation we're in now is because we've never been able to have a critical voice of discourse in the education professions in terms of talking about each other's work and engaging in give and take and exchange. It's something the other professions educate for from the very beginning. So unless we can substantially transform many of our practices, both within K-12 schools and in the schools of education, they could be having the same conversation 20 years from now. And that's a sad thing to say at this point in time.
Professor Kane.
So I'd love to save these systems for formative measures if we could put an end, if we could somehow postpone or stop high stakes decisions, but the fact is we can't. That high stakes decisions are made every single day on the basis of lower quality information than these systems generate. We have to remember that every time a probationary teacher finishes their probationary period and are hired back for the following year and therefore, in fact, move into tenured status or professional status, whatever it's, different places call it different things, a high stakes decision has been made. Now, the question is, was it made on the basis of the principal's, personal relationship with the teacher, or was it made on the basis of at least some evidence? For every Mrs. Cook, and I don't know the details of Mrs. Cook's situation, that was sounds terrible to use test scores down the street. I've heard similar stories in other districts. I think those most egregious examples are getting cleaned up as the data systems are getting going, but still, that's not an excuse. But we can't forget the fact that for every Mrs. Cook, a apparently good teacher who is penalized by arbitrary data, there are kids who are being assigned to teachers where I don't have a picture of the teacher standing in front of the school billboard, who are not serving the children in his or her classroom well, whose students are falling behind year after year. That was the issue, is do we do anything about that? And I'd argue, yes, we should. Now, there are some systems for instance, DC public schools was the site of tremendous amount of controversy just a few years ago. Has not been in the newspaper a lot most recently. I encourage you to look at what's happening in DC. The National Assessment of Educational Progress scores in DC since 2007 have increased more than any other state ever has. So now, DC is still underperforming, but the improvements in the, since 2007 are
We
quite
have data on DC, but we are
quite large.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
so we need to be working on these
Yeah.
issues, and there's some evidence
Yeah.
that the states that, and districts that are seeing progress.
This could go on for quite some time. Both our presenters have compelling data on Washington, D.C., and this is a very high stakes topic with very high octane evidence and opinions from different perspectives. Could we thank both presenters?